Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on AADL TV for an episode of Biblio Files, the little show where we take a few minutes each week to answer one question about books. My name is Amanda, and with me is Christopher and Lucy. And this week we are asking the question, what's your favorite poet? Christopher, what do you got this week?
Well, I haven't read a lot of poetry, but the poems that I have read and the poets I have read are quite varied, so it was still kind of a difficult decision. And then I suddenly remembered reading Spoon River Anthology. I was not an English major, and this seems like kind of an English major book to read, but I guess a lot of people don't know about it. It's written by Edgar Lee Masters, and it's more than 100 years old now, but it feels to me very modern in that the entire book is a series of little poems told from the perspective of people in a common graveyard. So everyone telling their little story is dead, and they're relaying the petty grievances and the jealousies and the secrets that they've kept all their life, and they're still upset even in the grave. And it's amazing to read all the poems because you get a full picture of this little town and all the relationships of all these people. So I think it's a really, and it's sometimes very funny as well. But every person is telling their own little story in a poem. And at the time that the book came out, it was a little bit of a scandal because the author often didn't even disguise some of the people he was writing about, and he took them right from real life. Not all of them, but some of them. So to me, it feels very modern, and the library does have a copy of this. So. Lucy?
So my favorite poet is actually a poet that I was introduced to when I was still living in Boston. Her husband was a big New Hampshire poet, and she was actually the poet laureate of New Hampshire. Her name is Jane Kenyon. I have one of her books here. Otherwise, I have a couple others of her books, but it's interesting. She is from Ann Arbor. And I didn't know that when I first started reading her poems, but she went to what would have been like Pioneer. She went to high school here. She went to the University of Michigan. And that's where she met her husband, who's another poet named Donald Hall. He was her professor. But anyway, they ended up getting married and moving to New Hampshire. And she sadly died pretty young of leukemia. And a lot of her poems, she dealt with depression, so a lot of her poems are about that. Some of her poems are about cancer treatment, but then she also has these beautiful poems about the natural world around her. And I think one of the reasons that I love Jane Kenyon's poems is that I find them very accessible. They don't seem cryptic to me, and sometimes there's a lot of poetry where I find you read it and it takes some time to understand what's even being discussed. She's pretty forthright in her poetry, but she has a beautiful way of describing things. So that's Jane Kenyon, and she happens to be from Ann Arbor. So that's kind of interesting. Amanda, who is your favorite poet?
So I don't read a lot of poetry, or I don't seek out a lot of poetry to read. So when I was posed with this question, I went plain, simple, boring, and went with one of the first poets that I fell in love with their writing, and one that got me interested in poetry and understanding the worth and value and beauty in poetry or singular lines in books. And that's Walt Whitman. That's on everybody's list. But when I first started reading his books, I was in high school, and I would go to the library, and I got this really cool book. It was sort of thin, but it was really thick, and it was some sort of edition of collected works. And I just would go through the hallways reading it. I had so many little slips of paper in there with little notes, and I would write down some lines of poetry and pass them out like notes in the hallway to friends, because I was so moved by them that I needed other people to read and absorb those words too, even if they were just random lines that wouldn't be like taken well out of context. But for me, I just really, really, really fell in love with the works and the words and thinking it. And it inspired me to write poetry. My poetry from high school is not very great. So going back, it's like a time capsule, a bit of a diary to my brain at the time. But just that idea of going to the library and getting out that giant book and carrying it with me like a little Bible and then writing notes to friends. But have I read a Walt Whitman poem in years? No. Most of the poetry that I tend to read now is just something that happens to be within a larger work or is in books of poetry for children. And as you both were discussing the works in the poet or the artist or the poets you chose now, I was thinking of other things I've read that I really enjoyed recently that would have been a good thing to mention here. But I'm just going to go with good old-fashioned Walt Whitman. It's a classic. So yeah.
Well, I like what you said too about just handing out lines of his. I think that's the thing about poetry. And Christopher, I feel like you said this in another one of our episodes, but that sometimes it's amazing how like the just the placement of words on a page can elicit a feeling, and I think poetry is so much about that. Like, I don't read a ton of poetry either, but when I do read a poem, that sometimes like that's the thing where you're just like, wow, because the word choice has to be so intentional. So I like the idea of you just handing out some of the words that you were gleaning from Whitman.
Yeah. I'm sure my friends at the time enjoyed it. Well, I think that'll do it for this week's episode talking about poetry. If you want to join in our conversation, below this video, you'll find a link that'll take you over to the library's website where you can leave a comment. Let us know, what are some of your favorite poems? Drop us a line from a poem. What are your favorite poetry that you like to read? Let us know. We'd love to hear what you're thinking at home. And we will be back again next week. And next week we will be answering the question, what is a book that you start and you never get to finish, or it's a slog to get through, and then you do when it's that aha moment? So next week, that's what we will be talking about. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.